This series has been supported by the LA Department of Water and Power, as well as the New York City-based organization Resilient Cities Catalyst. We did have a delay in starting this, but now we're up and running, and we had a great first class. And the purpose of this overall course is to give climate change advocates a better understanding of how market-based economies, such as the one that we're currently living in, deals with risk and the added risk that is part of our new climate reality. So here's our timing for today. We're going to start with a poll, but not yet. And then we're going to go through the outline of this class that is on the subject of insurance and pollution. And there will be breakout sessions and some additional polls for you. We like getting questions midstream, so please put those questions in the chat as well. And then we'll actually pause and stop for questions as well. So, as it is right now, why don't we do our first poll? Dana, do you have that? All right, here it is. This past week, Mr. Wheeler declined to regulate which toxicant that is linked to fetal and developmental brain damage. Testing your knowledge here. Okay, we have over 50% of the votes in. Okay, well, I guess we'll stop there. We have about 20 people voted, and yes, perchlorate won. Thank you. That's good to know. You guys are reading your materials. And for some of you who may not know this, perchlorate as a rocket fuel, which is or an explosive in fireworks, is the cause of most of the perchlorate in our environment. And that was actually discovered right here at Jet Propulsion Lab in the 1940s and was rolled out at in Azusa at Aerojet General in the 1950s. So thank you very much for knowing that little tidbit in fact, and we'll be coming back to that in a second. So what we have here is perchlorate 35%. Not to be confused with PERC. Perchlorate is the thyroid inhibitor. All right. I'm trying to get rid of this thing here. I want to tell you a little bit about our presenter, our instructor, and it is Wendy Nystrom. And Wendy is a veteran of the insurance world. And she began her career as an environmental scientist, and she worked on contaminated sites, very apropos for today's class. And she moved into pollution and insurance in 2001. And she's really a subject matter expert in this area, teaching widely throughout the US. And Wendy is currently in the sustainability world, looking at circular economy and ESG, and incorporating her environmental insurance knowledge with the latest developments in sustainability and triple bottom line fundamentals. Wendy's currently a member of the Los Angeles Metropolitan Transit Authority's Sustainability Committee. And she is about to be a commissioner for Public Works Department in the city of Beverly Hills. And no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Wendy Nystrom. Wendy.
Thank you, Jonathan. Dana, could you pull down the poll? I'm not sure if I have that capability. Maybe I do. Oh, there we go. So just thank you to Jonathan and everyone at Climate Resolve for inviting me to do this. The best part of what we're learning today about pollution, we're building off the background of insurance that we discussed last week. And then we're going to talk about pollution, the pollution exclusion, and all the regulations that started as a result of these contaminated sites. So real quick, we're just going to do a quick review of the insurance basics. Let's go on to our slide if I can. So course overview, this is the environmental regulation and pollution exclusion class. And today, just a quick review. We're going to have 3 case studies. Love Canal, which is the most famous one. It's in upstate New York. Times Beach, which is presented by Ben Harper. He is our guest speaker today. He is the head of sustainability from Zurich, North America. And the Stringfellow acid pits. That's what I'll be discussing before we take our quick little break to have our Q&A. And then we're going to jump into state and federal regulations, pollution exclusion, how we fill those exclusions, and then just risks and expectations in the future. So let's start with quick review. Insurance basics, some of the terminology we discuss. So policy limit, that's the maximum amount you will get from your policy. If you have a loss that's greater than that, your policy is going to be limited. So just make sure you discuss with your broker how much coverage you need, what your policy limit should be for the type of risk you have. Your deductible and SIR, we talked about the difference between those. Deductible is basically the amount that will be deducted from your claim. So if you have a $100 loss, the insurance company will take out that $10 deductible, give you $90. Simultaneously, a self-insured retention, usually for larger companies, larger risks, they're basically going to require you to pay that money up front before the insurance company is going to start participating in any losses. So that being said, if you have a $100 loss, your SIR is $10, you're going to have to show that you paid that $10 first. The insured, that's you or your company. The insurer is going to be the insurance carrier. Your risk is your possibility for loss. So as I gave an example earlier, it's a higher risk to live by the coastline right now because of the storm surges we have, lower risk to be inland. Peril is your cause of loss. So in a certain case in California, perils are wildfires. That is your peril for a loss. And then your liability is who's responsible. And part of liability is do no harm. Try not to harm other people and always take responsibility for that liability. And basically bodily injury, we discussed that being illness and disease, including physical. In certain cases, it can mean mental anguish. So someone can be mentally disturbed or upset and file a claim. And then property damage is always going to be a third-party damage. So you can't damage your own property and make a claim. It has to be something third-party. Going into when we talked about policies, so you have your commercial general liability policy. Again, that's third-party, so you can't have it, you can't do it yourself. It has to be an outside party that claims bodily injury or property damage on your premises or your operations or products. And then we go into property, which is really what we've been talking mostly about. So you have all your homeowners policies. So HO1, there's 11 specific named perils. HO2 starts with the same 11, but there are 6 additional perils that they add in there. So it's a little bit broader form. And then your HO3 is your special form. It's your most common type of policy. It's open peril means they cover everything except what's specifically excluded. So please look at your exclusions on your policy, because if you think it's open peril and everything's covered, it may not be. So you just want to make sure on that. And then HO4 is renters. If you don't own your home, it's just basically going to be your belongings. HO5 is your comprehensive form. It's going to be both your home and your possessions. It's very broad. Oddly enough, it's not the most common form sold, probably because of the price. And then HO6 and 7 is just condos and mobile homes. So going down to commercial all risks, that is, so you're not your dwelling, not the home you live in, but your commercial property, something that you own, that you run your business out of. It's a little bit different. It's called your open peril. Again, everything's covered except for what's excluded. So please always check your exclusions, ask for a copy of your full policy, not just that cover page, they call the declarations page, but the actual entire form. So it's good to always read everything. And then one of the things I wanted to show you is building a program. So this is what we call them a mud map. This is what insurance coverage will look like for a large corporation. This is their annual policy. So going from left to right, you have your auto, general liability, employer's liability, which is part of work comp, but it is capped at usually $1 million. Work comp, depending on the state you're in, it's called statutory limits, which generally means unlimited coverage. Foreign package, so this particular company had foreign liability. They did business, overseas. Then you have your work comp, your property, cyber, and it goes on and on. We're not going to pay too much attention to the others. So directors and officers, people who are executives that might be liable for things in the company. Fiduciary, K&R simply means kidnap and ransom. If you are working in countries where there's a high probability that someone may be kidnapped, you would want that coverage. And ending up with crime. So this, this is a real program put into place. I removed all of the proprietary information. But when you see, when brokers have a lot to put together and insurance carriers have a lot to put together, this is what it looks like. Different forms, different limits, different towers built on top of each other like Lego bricks, and it's all put together as a comprehensive form. Now, simultaneously, let's say you're building a sports stadium. So we have hypothetical Rachel's construction company won a bid to do a new sports stadium. Something called a wrap-up. Now, a wrap-up I'd like you to think of as a burrito. Your burrito, the inside stuffing is going to be all of your contractors, your subcontractors, anyone working on the site, and the tortilla is your policy. Everything's wrapped up together in one, and you want everyone to just be in that policy, same coverages, so no matter what the loss is, it's going to be the same type of coverage, same type of costs. Everyone's in the same burrito together. And it's a little different. So what you're going to see here, you have your general liability, employer's liability, work comp, your excess, that's $500 million in excess. And this is, again, from a real project that happened. And then you go into your builder's risk. That is, you're building your building, tornado comes, blows it away. That's your builder's risk policy, and it's insured for $1 billion if something terribly wrong happens. And then you have your pollution and your professional coverages as well, followed by surety. So surety is not necessarily insurance. A surety bond simply says, I am going to build it, and this is my guarantee for building it. So anyone who's working on a project site or doing a construction job will more often than not be required to have that policy or that surety bond. And one of the things I brought up a few times, captives, kind of coming back to this, it's basically an insurance company is wholly owned and controlled by its insured. So as we said, shareholders and their own business and their company, everything's encompassed and circular. What I added to this slide are sort of the steps that you can take if you wanted to pursue that. And it's something to think about with some of these coverages that we'll be dealing with in classes 3, 4, and 5. You can, you just have to determine your structure, do a feasibility study if you can do this, hire a manager. You want someone who's an expert in this. Select your domicile. As we said, there are 70,000 captives in 70 different countries. So this is not uncommon. This happens quite a bit. And then you have to submit your application to the domicile just to make sure you have the necessary capital to do this. So again, just keep that in the back of your head as we talk about fire and floods and surges and human health hazards, because it may be something you want to explore with your municipalities, with the utility companies, just something even homeowners associations could get together. Depends on what your risk is and what you're looking to do. And finally, the FAIR plan. I wanted to bring this home in California. We have the FAIR plan, but it is when you have no other options for your insurance. So you usually have to get 3 declinations. You have to prove that you couldn't get insurance in the regular markets, and you go to the FAIR plan, but the limits are 1.5 million for a dwelling. That's not a whole lot for the state of California. We know homes are valued at much higher than that, especially if you have to rebuild, especially if there are new permits that you have to get, new construction goals you have to do. It's named peril, so it will only cover fire or lightning, internal explosion, and smoke. That's it. Any other loss will not be covered. And it's actual cash value. So instead of replacing it, they're going to deduct the value over time, see if it's something older. And then with the commercial policy, sort of the same thing, 4.5 million in limits, named perils, actual cash value. And then business owners, which kind of puts things together with structure, contents, and liability. Again, limited in limits, 2 million for the structure, 1 million for your contents. And then just more details that we can go into at another time if anyone wants that. Now I'd like to go into our case studies. Love Canal is the first one. Time's speech will be presented by Ben. So Love Canal is one of the most famous ones out there. This is what kind of triggered our regulatory CERCLAs and RCRAs that we'll be talking about in a few minutes. But here's some background. This is what happened. So from 1890 to 1910, William Love was a man who wanted to create the new Venice. He wanted to dig canals, build homes, and just have this idyllic society. Unfortunately, he went bankrupt and his property was auctioned off. So you had large pits dug in the ground that were mainly empty, auctioned off. So the city of Niagara that's Niagara, New York, thought this is brilliant. We're going to use these as a dump site. Now back then, dump sites for cities were primarily just household goods. but then they granted permission to Hooker Chemical Company to dump their waste. And back then, it wasn't known to be as dangerous as it is now. People thought, great, you just have some chemical waste, not a big deal. Just throw it into canals, it's fine. So Hooker was actually smart. They actually drained the water out. They lined it with a thick layer of clay, so you can see the clay cap in that lower right-hand corner. If you completely encapsulate your waste site in clay, it's impervious. Now, it's not perfect, and over time, as I will discuss later, things crack, but it's a good idea to not have it in porous soils. So they drained it, they put in the thick clay, and they purchased the canals from the city. And by 1952, they ceased the use as a dump site because the city of Niagara saw a big population boom and they were building out a residential neighborhood. So for 10 years, that landfill they dumped 21,000 tons of chemicals. And it was buried from a depth of 20 to 25 feet, not too terribly deep if you're talking about building a residential neighborhood. So what happens? City of Niagara was going to put in a school. So Hooker Chemical decides this is a terrible idea. We can't stop them. They need to build a school. So what we're going to do is we're going to sell them the canals for $1. But we're going to have a limitation of liability put in there that says essentially, do not build here. It's a terrible idea to build here. We have dumped toxic materials. Please don't go digging around. Please don't go digging into our, the sealed up capsulated clay layers. And they even put in the actual deed, which is on the right-hand side. Unfortunately, that's the best quality I could get. But they said that due to chemical waste having been dumped in the area, the land was not suitable for construction where underground facilities would be necessary. Cannot be more clear than that. But unfortunately, that's exactly what the city of Niagara did. So they started digging, they started building, workers found dump sites, they found chemicals. As a result, they decided to move one of the schools just 85 feet to the north. That's not a whole lot of distance when you're talking about contaminated land. And children started to attend the school. Now, when you breach those clay layers, you're going to have failure. You're going to have these walls crumbling in and water's going to get in. And that's exactly what happened is water started to get in, holes were punched through for sewer lines. And this was right next to a school. So unfortunately, what happens, children start playing in the puddles. So as these clay covers cracked and pooling water started to happen with contaminated water, children started to play in the liquids. And around that time is when Hooker was bought by Occidental. A little side note there, just to keep in the back of your mind that Hooker's no longer, it's now 100% Occidental Petroleum. And they started testing. And that's when several sump pumps were found. They found the toxic chemicals. And no one was really paying too much attention until the Gazette got involved. And the Gazette started to do some studies, and they looked into how many birth defects there were, abnormalities. They noticed that there were a high number of miscarriages. So they discovered the size of the canal, the presence of dioxin, which dioxin is a numerous contaminant. It's not just one, it's a bunch of contaminants that actually have all of these related medical issues with them. So none of the residents who lived there actually knew the story of the chemicals being dumped there. So as things get worse, New York Health State Department actually investigated, and they decided that it was determined to be, what did they call it? An unprecedented state of emergency. And that's when Jimmy Carter stepped in, and that's when he decided that he was going to allocate federal funds to clean this up. That had never happened before. So this is when we start saying, federal government's getting involved, cleanup must happen, and we're going to give you money from the federal government to help you clean this up. And this is what kind of opens up all of the CERCLA, RCRA, things we'll get into in a moment. But one thing I do want to point out is that for 24 years, from the time that chemicals were first discovered in 1954 to when the site was shut down, that is an eternity. That's a child's entire lifetime, that this was basically just ignored until the end of until 1978, when they decided, okay, this is actually a problem. That's the brief history of Love Canal. There's a lot more information that can go into that. Due to time constraints and our other case studies, I just wanted to give you guys just a very brief synopsis of what happened and how everything got triggered. Now we're going to jump into the Times Beach case. And Ben Harper, who is our head of sustainability at Zurich North America, joining us today. I have a little background to tell you about Ben, other than being a friend of mine for the past, maybe 8 years, I think. He has a bachelor's degree in civil and environmental engineering from Southern Polytechnic State University and is also a certified cost engineer. He is the head of sustainability at Zurich. He works closely with government and non-governmental organizations, industry groups, and trading partners to influence, connect, and deliver on Zurich North America's sustainability commitments. He also sits on sustainability advisory boards for the American Society of Civil Engineers, the U.S. Department of Energy, as well as New York University. So, Ben, if you would unmute yourself, we can start with Time Beach. You're still muted, Ben. There you go.
Okay, sorry, it was saying that the host had to unmute me. So, thanks, Wendy. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me here tonight. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to provide some background on environmental and why it's so important, and why it's so important to know some of the past history and the way that it impacts some of the environmental hazards that we're dealing with today, including climate change, which is a space I work in quite a bit. So I just wanted to provide another example of one of the first large Superfund sites. Wendy already had a lovely story on Love Canal, and I'd like to think that I had a story with a happier ending, but I don't. But I hope you'll find it interesting. And this is another one of the really large environmental disasters that really promulgated a lot of the regulations that I believe Wendy's going to be going over in just a few slides. So Times Beach, Missouri, a small town founded in the early 1900s, primarily as a resort town along the Merrimack River. And just like so many small towns, that once it was no longer considered really a resort area, there was one primary employer, and it sounds like at the time it was quite a distance from St. Louis. I think it's about 20 miles, 17 miles southwest of St. Louis, which by today's standards is absolutely nothing. But this was considered out in the country a bit. And there's really one primary employer. In this case, it was a chemical manufacturing company that manufactured chemicals and pharmaceuticals. So next slide. So what happened at Times Beach? So the one chemical manufacturer produced a few prominent products. The largest one being Agent Orange, as well as DDT. They produce Agent Orange throughout the Vietnam theater, as well as DDT. And what's just as disturbing to me, as I found this later on, is they produce toothpaste flavorings and shampoo additives. So as a consumer of both of those items, I feel a little bit uneasy about having my toothpaste sitting in a vat next to Agent Orange. But this is what they did for quite some time. But one of the byproducts, and Wendy touched on this on the previous examples, one of the chemical byproducts of Agent Orange and DDT is dioxin. And dioxin is a very, very difficult contaminant to deal with. First off, the toxicity of it's off the charts. It bioaccumulates. It's considered a teratogen, which affects development of a fetus in the womb. So it can cause mutations. It causes some, it's really, really difficult on the unborn. And in fact, I think it's still true today. For the longest time, laboratories that analyze for dioxin, if you were female, you weren't even allowed to work on that floor. And I think that still holds true today, just because of the really difficult effects that it has, the bad side effects it has on an unborn fetus. So the chemical contaminant that we're dealing with here is dioxin, and the chemical, the manufacturer, in this case, unlike Love Canal, where they were just burying it in the backyard, they were trying to do the right thing. So, and by trying to do the right thing, they hired a waste hauler who was a local waste hauler that had been dealing with spent oil for quite some time. And the waste hauler happened to have another side business, which was spraying the unpaved roads. And in this particular town, Times Beach, they had 20-something miles of unpaved roads because it's a middle to low income town. And so most of the roads were not paved. So they needed dust suppression, and that was this waste hauler's other specialty was getting rid of waste and suppressing dust. Next slide. So it's what he did with this material that became real disturbing. He had a very successful, like I said, he had a successful business spraying roadways with primarily motor oil, which sounds like a really poor practice in itself, but it got much worse. Once he started accepting some of the chemicals from the local chemical manufacturer, in particular some of the real heavy sludges at the bottom, he found that he could mix that with some of the waste oil that he was collecting as well. And when he used that for dust suppression, it really had a great effect in suppressing the dust. So it was very good at what it was intended to do. But the bad part about it is just because it looked like oil and kind of acted like oil, it definitely wasn't oil. It was heavily contaminated with dioxin. And when he first started using that to he started spraying the roads and the dust suppression, it worked so well that he had local horse stables and arenas call him up and say, hey, I heard you've got this fantastic formula. Can you come take care of our horse arena? So he did. And within just a matter of days, they started, the first time he used this at a horse arena, they started having birds dropping from the sky. They had horses developing sores, losing their hair, and several of them just died. So they ended up removing the top foot of soil, sending it to a landfill. But the effects of the accumulation of the chemicals in the horses had already taken effect, and within a month or so, most of the horses in this particular arena died. So that was back in 1971. So he continued to spray the town from 71 to 76. So a period of 5 years, he continued to use that same material as a dust suppressant. And during that period of time too, a lot of the townspeople noticed that their children were suffering from various illnesses that were quite uncommon. And one thing that they noticed on a lot of the children was a condition known as chloracne. So think of it as teenage acne, but it occurring on toddlers. And it's a skin condition that's associated with dioxin poisoning. And in fact, it's a telltale sign of dioxin poisoning. So he kept spraying the roads. Children they started seeing these ill effects in children. They also started seeing a huge increase in birth defects, as well as a huge increase in unsuccessful pregnancies. So finally, the CDC got involved. And at the time, the CDC was really the go-to agency for toxicology, and it still is to a great extent. So the CDC came in 77. They started taking samples, and they realized that dioxin levels were extreme. And at first, they didn't really notify the town. They came back and they thought about it for a while, and they weren't quite sure where these extreme levels could come from. So another year goes by, they take another round of samples. Another year goes by, they take some more. And finally, they revealed to the town in 1982 that the dioxin levels, at the time, the safe limit was considered, I think, 1 part per million. And the average samples were hitting around 100,000 parts per million. So, several orders of magnitude over what was considered safe, and it explained a lot of the ill effects that the town had seen. Oddly enough, the day after the EPA announced that, the river flooded. It had reached unprecedented heights, and the fact that this material had been sprayed on all the roads, and now they had a complete flooding of the entire town. It's the largest flood that had ever been documented in Times Beach. You just kind of took this horrible toxic compound and you spread it out into areas that hadn't been touched. So the EPA recognized this. They took some more samples and they finally said, okay, if you left for the floods, don't come back. And if you're still in town, you need to leave now and you need to leave all your belongings. So, they evacuated the 3,000 people that were living there. It remains a ghost town to residences, although there is a portion of it after it was cleaned up and funded through Superfund. which Wendy's going to go over in just a minute. There is actually a state park there now with a visitor center, and the visitor center is really focused on the chemical cleanup of Times Beach. So, you know, you've got this area just 17 miles out of St. Louis, and it truly is probably untouchable for an awfully long time, even though, you know, it has been capped and it is considered safe in its current form. You can never really take a shovel to the ground because of what you'd expose. So this is just another one of the big environmental cleanups that really promulgated the passage of a lot of the environmental regulations that you're going to be learning about today.
Thank you. Just to add on to what Ben said, one thing to think about with these contaminated sites is, as he said, you can never take a shovel to the ground. So you can't disturb these soils. You can't dig into it. You can't build on it. It has to be left relatively untouched. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Ben. So now that we've talked about upstate New York, we talked about, you know, Times Beach, Missouri. The last case study is going to be closer to home for us, which, come on. Stringfellow acid pits. So this is just about 1 hour east of downtown LA along the 60. In 1956, there was a man named James Stringfellow, and he was approved by the Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board, long word there, to dump toxic waste into a rock quarry. Now, this rock quarry was up gradient, so up high. And he even had a geologist assure him that this site was safe. They said it was sealed, nothing could get through it. Now, in the world of geology and how impermeable layers work, there are cracks, there are going to be fissures, microcracks. Things do eventually get through. So nothing's perfect. So by the time in, you know, from 1956 to 1972, they determined that the pits were actually leaking into the groundwater, and they shut down the site. So you had 34 million gallons of liquid industrial waste that was dumped. These were volatile organic compounds, often called VOCs, and then you have semi-volatiles, which are SVOCs, perchlorates, pesticides, metals, bunch of contaminants. Again, this was industrial waste. And naturally, his company was bankrupt. This is generally what happens when you have these large Superfund sites, is the company's bankrupt, they can't clean it up themselves. So the title of the land was passed to the state of California, and oversight given to the Santa Ana River Water Quality Board. So on the right-hand side, you can see those are all the contaminants I was able to pull from online. My apologies for them not being much bigger, but in order to get everything there, I had to reduce the size. But basically between 1969 and 1980, you had spills and intentional releases into Pyrite Creek. Why intentional? They were trying to avoid larger floods. So they had the risk of a large flood happening, so they just did this intentional release. And it was listed as the most contaminated site in California in the 80s. So again, these are old quarries. They filled them, they went downhill, because groundwater will go primarily downhill unless confined. And so basically the floods of 1978 that were intentional, what happened was you had this stiff foam forming on the top of these puddles that children were playing in. One of the perfect examples I'd like to give is this woman, Penny Newman. She was referred to as the hysterical housewife. She was the one that noticed her children were making foam beards while playing in puddles. She thought it was weird. She knew about the contaminated sites that were up gradient from her, but she was assured they were safe. And she started to get very concerned and worried, and she became very vocal. She approached Sacramento. She worked with the USGS. She just tried to bring as much attention as possible. And through her persistence, she actually did get the response that she was looking for. And one of the things at the very bottom, you can see now that the DTSC, which is our California Department of Toxic Substances Control, they're currently managing that site. And they are estimating it'll take 500 years to clean up. So another thing to think about with these 3 case studies we've given, Love Canal was only recently deemed safe. It was also a town that was evacuated when they realized they had such contamination. Times Beach evacuated and cannot be touched. Basically, everything has to remain no digging, no building, no shovels in the ground. And then Stringfellow, where you basically have these acid pits contaminating the groundwater, and to effectively remediate, which would you suck the groundwater out and clean it and pump the clean water back in is estimated for 500 years, which is an eternity. So just some things to think about where we're actually going to jump into our discussion questions now, which I believe Dana's going to pop the questions for our 10-minute breakout, if I'm correct on this timing, hopefully.
Wendy, did you want to do the poll?
Sure, let's start with the poll. We have another poll for you guys, and that way we can kind of gauge what you're thinking about these case studies, and then we can go to some Q&A.
All right, Wendy, the poll results are in.
So yes, an overwhelming 84% believe that yes, we feel the same is happening with climate change. I agree. I think that we should be responding a little more quickly to the things that we're seeing every day and getting more people educated on what's happening out there. A lot of people don't fully understand the extent of how climate change is not only affecting quality of life, but as we're going to see in the later classes, we're going to pull from class 1 and class 2 how floods are increasing, fires are increasing, and the ultimate effect on human health. So if we can move on to our questions, we have 2 questions for you guys, and we're going to do a 10-minute break. Jonathan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else in respect to that.
No, I think it would be good for us to break out and have a conversation with folks. So please put the questions up there.
Great, and we will be coming back after the questions, so we don't want to lose anybody. So these are your 2 questions, comparing and contrasting Love Canal times beach. And then ultimately, who is responsible for cleanup? Who do you think is responsible for cleanup? The person who contaminated, the person who owns the land, the government? So just talk amongst yourselves. And when you guys break out, hopefully if you want to discuss it further, we can come back afterwards and discuss some of those results. So as we wait for everybody to come back, we're going to hop into our state and federal regs, and we'll do that in a few minutes. One of the things we're going to have, Ben Harper will be joining us as well, and he'll probably be hopping in and out with comments. And we'll have some questions at the end. We'll stop, have a little time since we're going to go through a lot of very interesting information here. But at the very end,
I
which
think we're
hopefully,
back.
oh, is everybody back?
I think we're getting there.
Okay. I'm just trying to let everybody know that we're going to start with the Fed regulations, and that Ben will be popping in as well if he has comments to make. Make sure Ben's back.
I'm back, Wendy.
Oh, good. Okay. I have a very small screen of faces I can see, so I couldn't really see you.
So Wendy, in our breakout, we had this a colleague of yours, Ed Morales, who promised us that you're going to talk to us about RCRA and CERCLA.
We will be. That's the next slides. He's psychic. That's exactly what we're going into. We're going into a timeline that I will fully admit that I swiped from Ben, because he's awesome and he shared some info with me. There's a beautiful timeline that he gave talking about all the coverages, all the regs, and we will be going into that once we get everybody back together, which I think is now. So let's get into this. See if I can get this going. There we go. So we have state and federal regulations. So as a result of all of these highly publicized pollution events that we had Love Canal, we had Stringfellow, we had Times Beach. All of these were recognized, and we had the EPA pass in, I believe that was in the end of 1970. But before that, we had NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, the California Environmental Quality Act, because California is usually ahead of these things, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is RCRA. We have the South Coast Air Quality Management District, or the South Coast AQMD. Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. There's a lot going on there, but that's our CERCLA, that's our Superfund. And then the Superfund was further amended with SARA that gives kind of more power. So it's not a comprehensive list, but you can see everything here, and we're going to discuss each one individually.
Hey, Wendy, if I could just add something here, since I believe most everybody on the computer is on this call is from California. I'm sitting in Georgia, and I'll have to say that when I've done work in California, it is one of the most highly regulated areas you could possibly do work. I've been on sites where the DTSC, Cal EPA, the RWQCB, and the federal EPA all claim to have priority rights on certain aspects of a cleanup. So the one thing I'll have to say about California is you've got plenty of regulators.
Yes, we do. And we kind of lead the way. I mean, when I first moved out here, everyone told me California leads the way. And I have to agree with that. I've been living here about 10 years now. And most of what we do with environmental, a lot of other states would kind of follow suit. Now, I know you're in Georgia. I'm not slamming Georgia, but one of the things I've noticed is we kind of come up with these regulations, and a lot of people do kind of adopt some of our ideas.
Yes,
so let's start. Go ahead.
No, particularly chemicals, certain emerging chemicals. People always look to California first because you guys take notice of these things. You're on the forefront of that, and for instance, a lot of these fire retardants now that are under a lot of scrutiny. It's because of California's good work and looking at the toxicology a little bit closer.
Yes, and that's one of the things that we will discuss in our fire class, which is next week, is suppressants are fabulous, great idea, but the end result being contaminating your water supply, what do you do? But that's our fire class. Right now we're going to talk about the regs. So this is the slide from Ben, History of Environmental Coverage, and it just starts 1970, NEPA was passed. We go into the CGL policy forum. Now, sudden and accidental pollution is very limited pollution coverage, and sudden accidental is exactly what it sounds like. You had a tank rupture immediately, suddenly had a little leak. We're not talking about long-term contamination or long-term releases, just something very quick and observable. 73, you had the Clean Air Act passed. Having been born in California, my parents reminded me of how bad the air quality was in the 70s. 76, you had RCRA enacted. 77, the Clean Water Act. 1980, that's when CERCLA, the SERPA fund, that's when that started, which is around the times that we had all of those case studies happening. So a direct result of CERCLA happening was because we had these sites that were so contaminated and required federal dollars. SARA was sort of the Superfund reauthorization. They made a few changes. And then in 1986, and this is what we'll just discuss after our next little break, is the CGL, the Commercial General Liability Policy Forum, has the absolute pollution exclusion. So because of all of these things that happened, people were claiming pollution coverage on their general liability. So as a result, it got excluded. So we'll talk about that and how that was addressed later on. And then with the clarification in the late 90s for the absolute pollution exclusion. So let's talk real quickly about NEPA and CEQA. So NEPA was passed on January 1st, 1970. It's a broad national framework for protecting our environment. So this is, 1970s, people weren't really understanding pollution yet. They didn't have a fully comprehensive idea of what they wanted to do. So it was very broad. And it basically, assured that all branches of government give proper consideration to the environment prior to undertaking any federal action. So broad form, give the branches of government a thought process. Simultaneously, we had California get involved. So California had their own ideas. They passed this, shortly after NEPA passed, and they required that state and local government agencies inform decision makers and the public. So now we're bringing the public into this, public opinion, public interaction about what's happening with the environmental impacts of proposed projects that were happening. So it's not as broad, a little more defined, going to get some public opinion in there, get people involved, get the citizens involved. And it's basically a statewide policy for environmental protection. If you want to call it sort of California's own EPA, sure, you can call it that. It's basically going to act as our own protection agency. Moving into RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 76. RCRA is what everybody calls it. So basically it creates your framework for the proper management of hazardous and non-hazardous solid waste. So before, you didn't really have anyone controlling where those drums went or where your waste materials went. It was kind of, a lot of people dump things in their backyards. If you did any, I did a lot of research in New Jersey, and New Jersey was well known to have buried drums because people just dumped. They just, if you owned the land, it was not a big deal. You just dig a hole and drop it in. So with the passing of RCRA, they said you can't do that anymore. We now know that that's very dangerous and will contaminate not only the land, but the groundwater that people are drinking. And then for California, you have your South Coast Air Quality Management District. So that little red outline for Los Angeles, Riverside, and Orange, that's basically the SCAQMD. And basically it's a pollution agency responsible for regulating stationary sources of air pollution. So in the 70s, California was well known for their bad air quality. I was born here in the early 70s. We moved to the East Coast, but I heard stories about, being kept inside. The police would have loud horns saying children and elderly had to be inside because of the poor air quality. We've gotten better, still working on it, but California, the LA region is a basin, and being a basin, things do get sunken and trapped. So, and there's also responsible for cars, mobile vehicles. Moving on to our favorite one, CERCLA. So this is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980. Direct response to Love Canal, Times Beach, the acid mines, Stringfellow acid mines. We realized that contaminating the groundwater, contaminating the soil, people are ingesting it, they're getting sick, they're exposed to it. You have to do something about it, and this is what established Superfund. Superfund allowed you to use federal dollars for cleanup. And I believe when Superfund was first started, they were given about $8 billion. So in the early 80s, that's a huge sum of money. And fortunately, actually, they got more money later on through RCRA. I'm sorry, not RCRA, SARA. But you were allowed to use federal funds. The most important is, through the CERCLA, they were given the power to seek out parties who are responsible. So potentially responsible parties, anyone who dumped at a site, who was thought to dump at a site, you were pulled in. you know, were you dumping here? You also often had a bill of lading that tracked that, and you were responsible. So before federal dollars were spent, you were actually, you know, brought to task by the government saying, if you dumped here, you're going to be responsible. You have to pay for cleanup. You have to participate in the cleanup activities. And then they were given the right to recover those costs as well. One of the things we talked about in our breakout room was something called joint and several liability. So the example I gave is if you and 10 other people dumped at a site, and 50 years later you found out that site was contaminated, and government came and said, you're responsible, you're the potential responsible party, you each have to pay 10% of this cleanup. Now, unfortunately, it's been 50 years, so maybe half of those companies no longer exist. People pass away, companies go bankrupt. So there's no longer 10 people sharing that cleanup cost, it's 5. So now your responsibility doubled. And that's essentially what joint and several means. You know, everybody's involved, but if some people aren't there, you just have to take on more. And if you're bankrupt, and that's when Superfund comes in, and they have to figure out who pays what. And then the SARA Act, that's a lot of information there. I'm just going to briefly go over that one. So the SARA Act basically is the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, happened in 1986, and it basically reflects the EPA's experience for administering CERCLA for 6 years, find out, you know, what works, what doesn't work. There was a bit of scandal in the 80s where people were misappropriating funds. So they stressed permanent remedies. If you recall from the Stringfellow, putting the toxic waste in a quarry that eventually leaked, that's not considered a permanent remedy. They want something that will never come back again. You resolve it, you clean it up. And those regulations do change in time. So maybe what was considered clean back in the 80s is no longer considered clean, and that site would actually be reopened, and you'd have to do some more remediation. You have to consider also standards and requirements found in other states. So it's not just you're living on an island. You have to work with other people, talk to other states, talk to other regulatory agencies, and everybody hopefully work together to come up with a standard that is deemed clean. Because again, what is clean? Every state's a little bit different. I did contamination and remediation in Boston. Boston is historically contaminated. They've been dumping things there for the last 250 years. So clean was considered background conditions. It wasn't great, but it's as good as you could get. You were never going to get to perfect. So you only got to background conditions. That would be very, very different if you were in, let's say, Wyoming, where they had no industrial, it's an open field. You'd want that back to clean, back to pristine, perfect conditions. So every state's going to be a little bit different. You had law enforcement. The state was involved in every phase of the Superfund program, so it wasn't just handed over to somebody to handle. They kept constant involvement. And that was a result of some of the things happening previously where misappropriated funds were disappearing. So all of that had to be taken into consideration. And what I find to be the most important was the creation of the National Priorities List, or the NPL. I personally call it the baby Superfund sites. This is where sites are found to be contaminated. They're put in the National Priorities List, and you can just Google that. You can look up NPL list and see what is considered to be a baby Superfund, something that may actually graduate to have to be cleaned up. So with that, we are actually nicely ahead of schedule. So we can take some time to stop for questions if there's anything in the chat box. And I believe Dana will have our third poll of the day. So we can pop that one up too. But this is a lot of information. We went through a lot of the regulations, a lot of case studies. So, you know, any questions, just pop those into the chat box. Hopefully I can answer them. Ben can jump in as well. Got a few more years experience than I do. And, you know, we can just go from there.
Wendy, it's Jonathan.
Yes.
Quick question. You've given a really nice background about, Love Canal and Times Beach and Stringfellow. My question to you is, what's the relationship between those events and the laws that they inspired and insurance? And then the next question is, what does pollution insurance have to do with climate change?
So all of those events, so with Stringfellow, Times Beach, Love Canal, all of those contaminated sites launched the need for CERCLA and RCRA, because nobody was paying attention to it. All of a sudden they realized nobody could pay for cleanup, even though you had to clean up. So that's when Jimmy Carter enacted in 1978, I believe, that you have to have federal dollars. No one person can clean this up because it's hundreds of millions of dollars in loss. And who's going to pay for it? You know, you can find out who caused the contamination, but most of the times they were bankrupt or they just didn't exist anymore. People passed away. So you had to rely on the federal dollars that were allocated for this. Moving into insurance, so the next topic is basically talking about the pollution exclusion that happened, because when these policies, all of these general liability policies got triggered as a result of these cleanup demands. So people said, hey, I have a general liability policy. It covers my property. It covers for property damage. Trigger it. That's what I buy insurance for. And unfortunately, the insurance industry had not anticipated that, had not planned or prepared for it financially. So going forward, they started adding their pollution exclusions. Now, to fill that gap in coverage, we're going to talk at the end about pollution liability insurance. So for contractors or if you own the land, and that fills that gap. It's basically a specialized insurance policy that you would buy if you own contaminated land or potentially contaminated land, or if you're doing work on a site that may be contaminated and you never really know. I myself almost blew myself up in Waltham, Massachusetts. I was the first time as a project manager, I was all of 22 years old. We did dig safe. We marked out every single pipe in line, drilling the hole in the ground. We went through a 12-inch high pressure gas main. It wasn't supposed to be there. It turns out Boston Gas used the wrong map. So because it was high pressure, the oxygen was displaced. And because the oxygen was displaced, it didn't spark the hole. Had it been low pressure, we would have most definitely blown up. I would not be here. So as a result of that, you know, you have your dig safe, you have your controls. That exact moment would be contractors' pollution liability. We were the contractors, we were doing the job. We marked everything out. So, you know, of course you subrogate against Boston Gas because they used the wrong map, but we did it. We drilled the hole in the ground. We went, I mean, it couldn't have been more perfect. We went dead center. So that's when you buy your pollution, you know, contractor's pollution liability. And then with climate change, when we talk about classes 3, 4, and 5, when we get into more discussion, more interaction from the people taking the class, I actually want to hear your opinions as well. We have pollution going into the atmosphere, off-gassing, smokestacks, things like that, causing greenhouse gases, the greenhouse effect, warming, leading to drought, leading to fire, leading to storm surges, jet stream changes. All of these are correlated together, ultimately ending in the, you know, high heat and health index, which will be our last class, that we have an expert talking about that. So this is sort of the very beginning of us talking about a chain reaction. Long-winded answer. Hopefully, Jonathan, I got to that. Ben, if you have anything to add to that, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe if I could just add something too, and Wendy, cut me off if this is something you're going to be getting into quickly. But with insurance too, there's really 2 distinct types of policies. One's called occurrence and the other is claims made. And the reason that a lot of these people could go back and claim insurance, I mean, as an insurance professional, I know there's at least 1 or 2 others on this call today. We still get claims for stuff that occurred back in 1952. I worked on a case just last year where our company provided liability insurance from 1952 to 1978, and they were claiming policy limits each year for environmental cleanup. And they could because it was an occurrence policy, because that event occurred during that policy period. Whereas a lot of the stuff we look at today is all on a claims made basis. So you could make claim during the policy period, but the day after that policy expires, you know, you may not have any, you likely don't have any coverage. So that's why everybody went back and started looking at some of the policies. And it was also because there was no regulatory driver to say that, you know, this was, definitely wasn't considered an illegal act, a lot of the dumping at the time. Then it was easy for them to come back and make claim. And as Wendy mentioned, the sudden accidental clause kind of clarified in that insurance never intended to pick something like that up, but it definitely wasn't perfect. Now, the tying into climate change is exactly as Wendy's saying. We're having some environmental releases now And as an insurer, we've seen a lot of really, we've had to defend from indemnity. We've had to defend suits, everything from the actual causation of or the exacerbation of Hurricane Katrina, because one of our insured happens to be a refinery down the street, to loss of cultural resources on an Aleutian island. So again, there's the tie-in will be that, insurance has always been used as a risk management tool to offload liability. This is a liability, in particular climate change, that everybody's still trying to get their arms around. And they were very successful in shifting some of the environmental liability that may not have been intended years and years ago to the insurers. And we're seeing a lot of that same movement today. And then with climate change, as an insurer, one of the largest things we're facing now is uncertainty in weather conditions. And we look now and at even like wildfires, the 8 of the 10 largest wildfires that have been documented in the U.S. have all occurred in the last 10 years. And we truly believe that the causation is climate change. So at the end of the day, almost like what insurers had to do for modern fire codes when San Francisco caught on fire one too many times, they all sat around a table and said, hey, we just can't do this anymore. This is going to be an uninsurable asset unless you make certain changes. And I think you're going to see the insurance industry stepping in too and saying, look, we're not going to be able to insure anything on the coast anymore. Now we're not going to be able to insure anything at that wildland infringement where we're worried about wildfires unless change is made. And not only changes from industry, but also changes from even a homeowner making certain changes and adopting and also having to adopt better policies on resiliency. So I think, Wendy, I'm sorry if I'm stealing some of your stuff over the next few days.
This is perfect.
But I think you'll start to see that the thread, the environmental thread that's woven through all of them is really interconnected in a pretty big way.
I have a very short question. Were there any insurance companies involved in the cleanup of Love Canal, Times Beach, and Stringfellow?
Yes, and they weren't involved during the initial cleanup. They ended up writing checks to the federal government, reimbursing them multiple years later. And that's the one thing about Superfund too. They have the funds to go in and clean up now, and they will come find you later. And they have some groups that are very, very good at investigating and looking through boxes of documents. And they know, they're very good at finding who used to dispose of there. And then those companies, although the federal government can go directly to the insurance company if that company is no longer solvent. So let's say Wendy's Waste Disposal went out of business, but they found out that she's got a liability policy from 1973. Then they can go after the industry direct.
Wasn't that called policy archaeology? Or there's a term.
There's a whole industry that's just around finding environmental liability.
And those would be occurrence-based coverages, not.
Yes, that's why you're going to see almost all claims made on primary pollution policies these days.
Does that also include current CPLs? Because when I was writing CPLs,
no, CPLs can be a little bit different, but CPL is not really attached to a specific site.
And a CPL is?
Contractors Pollution Liability. Yeah, that's what we'll be talking about next. We'll be getting into filling the gaps.
We have 2 questions that we'd like to turn to. One is from Lisa Shivavinato, and she asks, what are some additional resources, as in books or reliable websites, to learn more about the case studies that were discussed and the history behind the federal laws that were passed?
EPA.gov has a lot of information. For Love Canal, I think I found most of my information through the City of Niagara's website. They do the history of Love Canal. Same with Stringfellow. I found Stringfellow had a lot of information for the, I think it was the County of Santa Ana, or the Santa Ana Water Regional Board, and also DTSC, because they will give you updated info on where they're cleaning up. Unfortunately, their most recent document was from 2017. So not terribly recent. I think it's more in line of their monitoring right now, trying to figure out next steps to get it out of that bedrock.
I'll add one to that too. There's one called rtk.net, right to know.net, but it's RTK. And what's interesting about that is it may not give you the case studies and the history, but it combines a lot of the RECRA, CERCLA, Superfund, MPL, all those lists into one very easily searchable database. And so what's interesting about that is you can type in your address and you can find out what's around you. And I think that's very important to just know what's in your community as well. So rtk.net, I think, is something that many people here might find interesting.
And Ben, we have a question from Jen Bravo to you. Do you think insurance companies might be willing to go out in front of these disasters and actually invest in resilience activities or infrastructure in order to reduce their risk?
Absolutely. In fact, if there's anything we're preaching right now, it is resilience. We can only do so much as an insurer. We can't force regulations, but what we can do is the term we'll use is risk-based pricing, which just means, if something's too risky, it's not insurable, or the price that you will pay for insurance is extreme. And we do that trying to spur certain changes, maybe to a building code, or maybe just discouraging development of a certain area. Now, are we willing to invest in resilience ourselves? To an extent, we are doing a lot of community resilient investment, but we're really focusing on the areas that are getting hit hardest these days, unfortunately, are the people with the least. So where you're going to see a lot of our direct investment in resilience activities is going to be in a lot of the small island developing nations, primarily, because we have seen the effects of climate change are hitting them the hardest. And they're some of the most vulnerable people that on the planet to begin with. So yes, we're going to invest in resilience. We're going to continue to do it. We back a lot of the stronger infrastructure boards. I personally sit on the Resilience Infrastructure Board for the American Society of Civil Engineers, which we're tasked with trying to develop new standards to build more resilient infrastructure. So great question, and I could preach resilience for another hour and a half, but short answer is absolutely.
Juliet asked a question if the URL for the background documents on the right to know is usrtk.org. Is that it?
The last time I looked, it was just rtk.net, but I have heard from somebody that that database was purchased by, I want to say it was like the city of Houston's newspaper. I'm not certain, but I will try to find that. And and maybe Wendy can post it up on her next class. We'll make certain we get the URL to everybody.
Another question by Carlos Moran. How do those burdened by climate change protect themselves through insurance coverage, like renters who are in low-income communities who are facing environmental burdens?
Well, I think that's the biggest challenge is that, and unfortunately, that's what we're seeing about climate change is impacting the people that are most vulnerable right now. And so we don't really have a solution on just, I guess from a socioeconomic standpoint of how we can target a certain area. All I know, what I can tell you though, is that when we do provide policies, and particularly in some of those areas, we really try to push, and we do this a lot of times at no cost, build back better type policies. So if something does occur, know that what we're going to provide post-response is going to be better than they had before. And hopefully next time an event occurs, and unfortunately with the changing climate, it's likely that another event will occur. The the damages that they're going to withstand are going to be significantly reduced.
And to add on to what Ben said, one of the things for the purpose of this class is giving you the background of insurance, how insurance works, talking about pollution. When the next 3 classes, when we talk about fire and flood and human health, is many people will approach people like Ben, people like me, and say, how can you just insure climate change? How can you just cover these changes in the environment? For insurance to work, we need to identify the peril. We need to identify the risk. What are we covering? How do we manage that loss? So one of the things with these classes is we want to discuss back and forth. What do you see? How do you want to see it change? How would you identify it and describe it? So it is something that you can wrap your head around, properly cover it, and then turn that into a policy, because these policies are getting updated all the time, especially right now. And Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that many companies, including Zurich, are creating new forms, new policy forms. Some people are working on covering mangroves. Some people are working on covering coral reefs, because they ultimately will stop that storm surge from hitting a property. So something that's never been done.
Nature-based assets. Just
Exactly.
like we're looking at the city of New Orleans right now. And it's interesting. Everybody talks about the recent flooding and how come they didn't experience the level of flooding 100 years ago. And a lot of it's because the nature-based assets have now been destroyed. They used to have massive oyster banks at the beginning of the river. The Chafalaya Basin used to act as more of a flood area for the city than it does now. And additionally, there's a lot of man-made reasons as well. But you're right, Wendy. We're looking at protecting mangroves. We're looking at doing some tidal programs. I got off the phone this morning with the indigenous people in northern Canada about putting together a program around carbon sink and reimbursing them as stewards of the forest. So yeah, there's a lot of exciting things we can do. The one thing is there's no one silver bullet. And we not only focus on nature-based solutions, but there's other things like carbon capture and sequestration that we're heavily involved with. We're trying to help with some of the financing now, because that is a key component to a 1.5 degree society by 2030.
Exactly, and that's, again, no one has the right answer yet. So the more it's discussed, the more that we get input from the outside, we can start thinking that process and working through how to get it fixed. Because when I first started getting interested in this last year, people were just saying, well, why don't we just cover climate change? And I thought, well, how do you just cover climate change? How does that look? And I know, Ben, you and I have had that discussion repeatedly, because you have to have something you can manage, a risk.
Well,
that you can
and climate
see.
change looks very different to different people.
Yes.
There's wildfires, there's coastal problems, there's there's a host of things that climate change, a host of perils that climate change helps create. So that's the other thing too, is climate change is broad, and
Yes.
when you look under the sustainability umbrella, it gets even larger.
So Ben and Wendy, I've unmuted a very special person who's listening in right now. Her name is Duane Muller. And Duane, you are unmuted and you could speak now. Why don't you tell your background on international climate issues having to do with risk? Because so many of the questions that are coming up in the chat have to do with things like the impacts on other countries and having to do with things like hurricanes and whatnot. So maybe you could address that.
Sure, thanks, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can see you
Great.
too.
Great. Duane Muller, I work at UCLA on the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, but previously I worked in the federal government for 14 years at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where I did a lot of work with developing countries. And insurance actually came up a lot in the UN negotiations, because a lot of the countries that we worked with often did not have insurance. We're talking about the small island developing states. And so this discussion is fascinating, but I think there is really an insurance gap globally. Here in the United States, yes, we have a lot of disasters that hit people who are not insured, but when you look at the developing world, insurance just is not an option for many people. And so curious, I know reinsurance has been discussed for many years. I know in the negotiations, we talk about loss and damage, that a lot of developing countries, small island states specifically, want, to get credit, or they want funding from the US, for instance, and other developed countries to basically say, you created this climate change challenge.
Right.
And it's a very contentious issue. And I mean, I served on the US delegation, so we had to answer these questions, and it was just very challenging. And I think it remains an important topic today.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And we've seen the same thing. If you look at all the natural disasters that have occurred over the last 5 years, they're increasing at a massive rate. But what's even more alarming is the gap at which these incidents are insured or not. So while we're talking, the gap continues to widen between what's insurable and what's actually occurring out there. And I think a lot of the key to this is going to be certain programs that people are looking at, such as one that we participate in Blue Marble, where it's micro insurance. And, what can we do? We've been doing some focused efforts with, farming communities in Vietnam and in Ghana, for instance, who are very vulnerable as well, and trying to provide some kind of micro insurance solutions. The other thing you're going to find is Wendy had touched on captives. And I think that that's definitely something that's a tool in our toolbox that we may be able to deploy with a bit more ease, and it may have a little bit more mass appeal, particularly with some of the small island developing states, as you've mentioned. It's still something. Those are some areas where we're trying to focus. We're really focusing on resiliency efforts and trying to push that forward. But at the end of the day, even employing resilient efforts isn't going to keep some of these really vulnerable communities from still experiencing disaster. So, I'm looking at things such as microinsurance, and I really think that if we do some kind of localized captive play, then there may be some solutions there. Is it going to be perfect? Absolutely not. But we got to start somewhere.
And just to add to Ben's, with respect to the captives, I am kind of hammering this. I've talked about it in both classes now, and in the fire class, I'm going to go through sort of a diagram that I created. It's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. You're always going to have more ideas, more input, more sources, but it'll give sort of a visual of how one may be able to work. And as Ben said, is it going to be perfect? No. In fact, the first ones that go out there might be disastrous because we don't know what to expect yet. With insurance being the way it is, we have a couple hundred years of data to work off of for general liability, work comp, marine. This is brand new. We have no historical data. Everything that's happening is brand new to us. Our data only goes back maybe 10 years for some of these catastrophic events. So it's a learning curve. It's got to be, trial and error, see what works, see what pricing works, see what coverages, the, attachment points, meaning the deductible SIR. So that's why I'm hoping we get as much input as possible, as much dialogue going as possible. I have other experts coming for the other classes that will give their input as well, who study fire, who study floods, who study human health, and just to see where we can go from here and how we can, maybe bombard Ben with a few thousand emails of how to make things better.
Yeah. And I think one other thing I might add too is parametrics is something that's being pushed around a lot.
That's
I don't
what
want to get,
yeah.
I don't want to get too many details
3.
on it today. Okay, that's class 3, but I think parametrics may come into play in some of these vulnerable areas as well. Because
I go into a lot of detail on that.
Okay, good deal. Well, I will leave it at that then, but just notice that that's another, I think.
No, you open Pandora's box, you got to talk about it now.
Well, parametrics is an insurance that will pay out when a triggering event occurs. And for instance, there's a program that they've implemented down in an area of Mexico that's very dependent upon the tourism. In fact, it's like 90% of the area or the economy is tourism, and they're worried about destruction of the reef. And so I know that there's a program there where there's going to be a payout. There's an initial investment. They set up like an LLC. Some of the resorts continue to pay fees into this LLC to fund some of the premiums, and then the payout is when a wave crests so high or the wind speed reaches 140 knots. And I'm not sure of what parameters are, but that's what parametric insurance
It's our
really
case
is.
study.
Okay. Oh, you're using that as a case study? Okay.
Yeah, class 3.
I would have used a different example, but now you're going to hear about the
No,
details of that
I'm sorry,
one.
it's class 4. Class 4 is floods, fires next week. So class 4, it's like, no, this is great though. It's good foresight. So people are like, so where is this all going? This is where it's going. This is why we're doing this. We're going to talk about parametrics. We're going to talk about case studies of where they're first implementing it and seeing what happens. And then hopefully we do more.
So
Yes.
Ben, there was one request for that blue marble micro insurance. Could you provide maybe a website link to that service?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll have that and I'll verify the RTK net as well.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
And I will make sure that that is shared. So as much as I love this discussion, we do have a few more slides to go through before it's over, and then we'll continue with our discussion at the end. Hopefully we'll have, because this class will go to 5:30, hopefully we'll have a good 15 minutes of dialogue at the end where we can just bombard Ben with as many questions as we want, because he is actively doing this. He is in the front lines of this coverage. And to touch down on the poll, so many people would not go to Times Beach right now. Curious about the 2 that would. Good for you. Tell us how it is. I think that's fabulous. But let's get on to, hopefully I can get this thing going. The pollution exclusion. So since we talked about CERCLA, the regulations, and how people started using their general liability policies to pay for this, commercial general liability responded, the insurance carriers rather responded by putting on an exclusion. And that exclusion is extremely detailed. So this is an actual pollution exclusion. So bodily injury, property damage, or personal and advertising injury, everything that's on the GL, arising out of the actual, alleged, or threatened. So it doesn't actually have to happen. It can be alleged spill release or a threatened spill release, discharge, emission, dispersal, seepage, leakage, migration, release, or escape of pollutants. It's a lot in there. Now let's go down to what defining a pollutant is. It's any solid, liquid, gaseous, thermal irritant, or contaminant, including smoke, odor, vapor, soot, fumes, acids, alkalis, chemicals, and waste. Waste will also include anything recycled, reconditioned, or reclaimed. Anything you could possibly think of is going to be one of these. So if you have any release, escape, threatened, or actual, pollution exclusion will most likely kick in, and you want to make sure you have that separate coverage that we'll go into a moment. But these can cost millions of dollars, and many projects are going to require, if you're doing a project at a site, the owner of that property will probably require that you have special pollution coverage in place before they'll let you start doing any work. So just on the side is a little diagram showing you of what seepage can look like. It'll get into your water table, it'll get into your groundwater, you have a contaminated well showing up there, and then it goes right into the waterway. And that's basically the migration of water going downhill, contaminated plumes going, and the contamination hitting a natural resource. And natural resource damages is basically any waterway or natural resource that is contaminated, and it's extremely expensive to clean up because now you have the government that's going to fine you. Before we get into the coverages, there are a couple exceptions, very few, but with respect to your CGL, you have these exceptions for owner-occupant exclusions. There's a lot of information in there, but in short, all it's saying is if you have an air conditioning system, a heating system, boiler, water heaters, so anything that causes smoke or fumes or vapors, that's excluded. Those are things that are normally on your property and something could happen. They get that. This isn't you bringing toxic waste to your property. Next one down is contractors. So you're doing a job at a site. So basically, this is an exclusion. So an exception to that pollution exclusion is if you have any bodily injury or property damage from the escape of fuels or lubricants or other operating fluids needed to perform whatever work you're doing from mobile equipment. So that's the key trigger there, mobile equipment. So I was on a job site, 22-year-old kid, and the guy had a backhoe on the property, digging a hole in the ground. We were test pitting, and the pipe blew. I'm sorry, the hose blew, and all of a sudden this fuel just comes squirting out. And that is something that would be an exception. It was his mobile equipment, a hose blew, fuel leaked, that would be a contaminant. But because he needed it to do the job, that would not be something the pollution exclusion would trigger. Ben, I don't know if you have anything you want to add, or if I got something totally wrong, just let me know.
No.
You never know, things change. Going on to property. So the first one was the pollution exclusion with CGL. Now we're talking property. Now, as we talked about different kinds of properties where you have your named peril coverage, you're not necessarily going to need a pollution exclusion because it's not a named peril. No named peril, no coverage. But if you have that open peril coverage, again, open peril, they say they're covering everything. Check your exclusions. You always want to read that exclusion page. And that's going to be where you'll find your pollution exclusion. And it's any losses caused by the discharge, dispersal, seepage, migration, release, or escape of pollutants. And again, it's the same pollution definition: solid, liquid, gas, thermal irritant, so heat. Heat could technically be excluded. Contaminant, including smoke, vapor, soot, fumes, acids, alkalis, chemicals, and waste. Very encompassing, very broad, so you just want to be careful of that language. And if you are going to be working on a site or you own property, this is where you actually want to get your coverage in. We call it contractor's pollution liability and also pollution legal liability. The only difference, contractor's pollution, that's your coverage if you're working at a site. You don't own it, you don't rent it, you don't occupy it. You're doing a job. Pollution legal liability is site pollution. You own the land. You're worried about anything on your land or going off your land or someone contaminating onto you. So that's where we go into our final slide before our discussions, or rather, yes, that final slide. And it's basically, again, contractor's pollution is third-party coverage, so you can't cause the damage yourself and claim it. It has to be third-party. Someone else is coming to you saying you damaged me for that property damage, defense, cleanup. So it does cover your defense costs. You know, you need an attorney, it'll be in there. You need cleanup costs for damage that you caused, it's covered. And it will cover the pollution conditions. The only thing you have to be wary of is you do not own, rent, or occupy the site. You're doing a job at someone else's property. Now, simultaneously for pollution legal liability, that's property you own. This is first party coverage. If you know that you have a pollution condition, it's highly unlikely you'll get coverage because it's basically saying my house is on fire and I now want coverage. You know, it's going to be very difficult. So the pollution legal liability is for third-party claims of contamination resulting from your property, so something migrating off of your property into someone else's property, you know, your own property being contaminated. And in some cases, it's called off-site coverage. So someone's contamination came onto your site. So there's a huge laundry list of coverages you can get in a pollution legal liability. And, you know, if you choose to, you can just pick and choose. I think it's coverages A through E, and you just pick and choose on-site, off-site, known, unknown. There's a huge list. Now, one of the things I wanted to bring up was I said something really dumb in the last class. In the last class, I talked about smokestacks and pollution coming from those smokestacks. And, you know, why is this not covered by a pollution liability policy? It's contamination. Well, that's an intentional act. So even though there's chatter talking about, you know, political agencies, they are talking this where, yes, it should be covered. But the problem is every insurance policy will exclude an intentional act, meaning you cannot set your house on fire and then make a claim saying my house burned down. This is the same thing. Not only do you know you're contaminating through the smokestacks, you're getting a permit to do it. So permits are required for smokestacks, air pollution, as well as any wastewater you're discharging into a river or a stream. So it's not only saying, I know I'm doing it, but I've been given permission to do it. And that would be excluded under a policy. So that's why that isn't actually covered. And more than happy to have a dialogue about that. We got Ben here, who's also an expert in this. This is kind of, you know, how he and I met and started working together. So that is our last pollution slide. Our next class is June 30th, where we talk about droughts and wildfires. We have a guest speaker, Joy Langford. She works for Assemblywoman Autumn Burke. This is where we're going to get into dialogue. This is where we're going to start talking about captives and how can we make this coverage change and evolve. What are your recommendations? What do you see that you need to change? You know, underprivileged areas, how can we fix it? So any questions? I guess Jonathan can now jump in and ask those. And we still have Ben, even though he's 3 hours ahead, and I'm very grateful for his offering to do this. So please ask away.
Wendy, I'm not seeing questions, but I have one. I'm under the impression that you're very carefully marshaling an argument that some of the insurance companies are in a kind of transition time where, in the same way that they went for pollution exclusions, they may do the same related to some of the climate impacts. And is that the argument that you're marshaling?
I don't think it's that they're excluding. It's where the insuring agreement is worded that there actually wouldn't be coverage for climate change because it's not something you can, that's
Right.
tangible right now, that's a known peril.
But right now, wildfire is such a threat to, let's say, people living in Topanga Canyon or in the Palisades Hills or in parts of Malibu that didn't burn in the Woolsey fire, that that I'm sure their insurance rates have increased dramatically. With climate change, we might see the same kind of fire that we saw with the Woolsey fire happening more regularly. I would imagine that the insurance companies are trying to figure out a way to not lose their shirts, having to respond to those kinds of coverages.
True. So in the first class, when we discussed about, how do insurance companies stay in business? How do they make money? If an insurance company is going to continue to cover these wildfires, which we know have multi-billions of dollars of losses, they will go bankrupt. And if you don't have the insurance company, you don't have coverage. So they're now all reevaluating the risk. It's a heightened risk. What was considered a wildfire that would happen every 10 to 20 years is now happening every single year. I mean, they used to say every 2 to 3. I honestly believe we're now going to see this every single year. So when you're going to have these massive losses, how do you prepare for that? How do you finance for that? Because there was a company in California, an insurance company, that went bankrupt. They provided a bunch of coverage for wildfires and they couldn't pay everything. So that's the going forward, is reevaluating the risk, reevaluating the severity of the peril, the frequency of that, and trying to underwrite to it where you won't go bankrupt. And unfortunately, that will be rate increases, limitation coverages, which is why in the next class, the fire class, talking about captives, talking about ways for resiliency with, reduction of brush, clear cutting, widening roads is a little bit more difficult, but a lot of these roads that are in the hills, so, north of Beverly Hills, in the canyons, these are little tiny roads that's basically one way in, one way out. You can't get a fire truck up there. And that's a huge concern for not only fire departments, but insurance companies, of how do we insure something that we can't even get a truck up there to put the fire out. And then people talk about fire retardants, and let's put sprinkler heads all around a house so it just ejects the fire retardant. Excellent idea, but now you're dealing with a toxin. So there are so many things going on and so many things to discuss. There's no answer right now. There's no perfect answer. It's something that has to be constantly discussed and worked through, multiple scenarios given. Ben, if you wanted to jump in, you're actively involved.
I would say that wildfires is about as difficult an issue as we're facing these days, particularly in California. It's tough, and a lot of it's because people are living in areas that that have traditionally not been habited. So that interface is called the wildland interface, and we're having to bring in utilities, overhead electrical lines. You're in some areas, people are starting to enjoy the desert areas that are traditionally very, very dry. And so we're introducing a lot of these hazards ourselves, which is okay because, people are going to, expand and explore and move into some of these new areas. But I think that's where you're going to find that stressing resilience to such a degree. And we've looked at some of the wildfires. We've done several studies. Zurich's got a Flood Alliance program that we also do wildfire studies on. I'll send a link to that as well. There's some great information. And one of them was about the California wildfires and some of the new construction that was built to certain resilient standards required by local code, and compared and contrasted that to some of the structures, some of the older structures that didn't benefit from those same construction standards, and the results were extremely different. With the new standards definitely making an impact. And so, I think from an insurance perspective, it's going to be a combination of a regulatory framework, of probably technology. There's better sensing technology. We had a guest talk to us about he's actually a meteorologist in San Diego, and why are the wildfires there much less intense and much less frequent? And I think he's correlated that to being able to determine wind speed and react correctly. So I think it's going to be a mixture of policy framework, technology, and just the stress of resilience in order to get our hands around something like wildfire. But that's a very tough one for us right now.
Is PG&E self-insuring, or are there some insurance companies taking that bet with PG&E?
I'm not certain yet. I don't know if I can speak to what our position is on that right now.
Okay. We have a lot of questions that have come in. One was from Arlene. She wanted to give you guys a case study. She's asking if a FedEx delivery truck that's using diesel parks in the alley behind her, and the diesel fumes goes into her apartment window, and he's parking in front of a no parking sign. So can she bring, if she, I'm assuming, Arlene, and I don't know if I'm speaking for you correctly, but do you have some kind of a claim against FedEx for potentially harming your health? And I don't know how to answer that question.
You can always file a claim. It just depends on if the policy will respond, and Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, since that would be intentional release. It's, it's a truck, it's belching out. And I doubt a policy would respond to that, but smaller claims. Go ahead.
I think yes and no, because they're also designed to emit emissions in an open air space, and probably not something in a closed environment. And that that driver, by putting that vehicle in a particular situation, probably created something that was unintended. And so would it likely be covered? Yeah, probably so. With insurance, you can never say yes 100% without knowing all the detail. But I would say that that's likely a covered claim. And, if anything, the carrier, might try to look into what were the errors of the driver that caused this, and maybe go back to FedEx and say, hey, look, there's something wrong here. But I would say that that's probably a covered claim. And I just want to note too that we're talking about toxic chemicals and everything. If you read the description of some of the pollutants, we've seen claims that are from materials that are very, very innocuous. An example would be, we had a very large claim where a truck full of milk spilled into a creek, and the milk went into a large pond. Because of the sugar content of the milk, the algae bloom was intense after like a week. Took all the oxygen out of the lake and caused a fish kill. That was something that's still considered a pollution event, even though I think we all agree that we'd probably feel much safer drinking milk from this truck than we would, anything from Times Beach or Love Canal. So I just want to put that out there, that there's, you always have to look at some of the cause and some of the effect, and that sometimes it's a little bit more, or not as black and white.
Question from Will Golding. How does a state get insurance coverage for wildfire related to public lands that provide timber?
Cool.
Huh.
I got to field that one to you, Ben.
This is one I'd probably have to think about for a while as well. Because first off, property coverage for timber that's another difficult space just because of the wildfire. So what's the valuation of that area? I will tell you that in my, in some discussions with, in some work that I'd done with the UN probably 10 years ago, they've got a program called RED. It's reduced deforestation and degradation. I forget what it all stands for. One thing about working in the insurance world, and I see Ed's on the line here. At some point, we need a chief acronym officer, a CAO, because we've just got so many acronyms between the environmental space and insurance. It's a little crazy.
Don't forget, sustainability has their own set of acronyms.
Correct, and we change them from year to year now. So we were looking at timber growths in Brazil, and what we could do to reimburse the native population for making certain that the growth there was still available as a carbon sink, and also recognizing that particular area influences the weather here in North America to a great extent. And there was different ways we were looking at providing insurance, but at the end of the day, the biggest problem that we've been finding with ensuring that as a fixed asset is wildfire. And it wasn't a problem 10, 15 years ago. These days, it's a very different world. So I don't know if I've got an exact answer, but I can tell you that the one good thing about this industry is you can be creative with certain things.
Mm-hmm. I would assume there's also, timber harvesting performed by private companies, and I bet you dollars to donuts those private companies have figured out an insurance mechanism.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times too, if they're managed forest areas where they're doing controlled breaks and controlled burns and stuff like that, it makes it much more insurable than just large swaths of land that are unmanaged and considered just timberland.
But I think to the question that Will offered though was, how do we get the state, perhaps for state managed lands, could they get insured as well? Anyway, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I
What
wish
about
I had a
also,
better answer.
just not to beat the dead horse, what about loss of revenue for the timber lost? Would there be coverage there?
Potentially. It just depends on what we want to put on the coverage grant. And,
Okay.
and we did look at loss of timber. I know down in Brazil, because they were going to cull the land. There was so much of the timber that they had to take out every year. It was good for the forest. It prevented fires. And there was very much some value to that timber as well.
Okay.
Well, I don't see any additional questions at this time, but I just want to thank you all for being part of this class, and that we're coming back a week from today for class number 3.
Yes, which drought, wildfires, and as Ben touched on, parametric insurance. This is where we begin talking about that, what it means, and how we can maybe incorporate it into future plans for this type of coverage and what we'd like to see change.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.